Welcome to Watercolor for Beginners. In this video, you'll learn 6 basic techniques and then apply what you've learned in a small floral application at the end. I'm Melanie of Melanie Stewart Designs. I'm a fine artist specializing in watercolor, and I teach in-person watercolor workshops. I'm going to show you a couple basic techniques that I teach in my classes. You'll need minimal watercolor supplies. You'll start out by choosing a paper. So I have cold press. It has a nice toothy texture to it, but it is a student level paper just for practice. A round brush. It has a tip and a belly. It's a dual purpose brush. I recommend round for this video. And a rag or a sponge or a paper towel, something that can absorb water and that you can clean your brush off with as we go. You'll also need a large vessel full of water. I like a big mason jar, but a cup will do. And then whatever watercolor paint you prefer. Okay, starting off with exercise number 1. I'm going to wet my paint, load my brush up, and we're going to do a wash. So you're just covering some surface area on the paper with one single pigment and trying to evenly disperse the paint. So I'm going to go through and try and pull the paint around this square and make it nice and smooth. Get used to my brush, get used to my paper. This method is handy if you're doing landscapes, skies, anything with big surface area that you want to evenly distribute some color. Okay, I'm going to clean my brush off in my water and then move on to exercise number 2. So this next one is a wet on wet technique. I'm using wet paint on top of wet paint. So there will be 2 layers, which is why I'm choosing a lighter color for my first layer. So I'm going to go back in and do the same technique we did in step number 1. I'm going to do a wash, spread the paint around, make it nice and even. And then I'm going to go back in for layer number 2 with that maroon color, since it's a little bit darker. Wet my brush with some paint. And now on top of the wet paint, I'm using wet paint. Wet on wet, you can see how the water has a mind of its own. It spreads it. It looks abstract. It's seamless. It blends. I love this technique for my watercolor florals because it really spreads it throughout the petals and gives it a nice loose modern look. Okay, number 3, we're going to do a wet on dry. So we're painting another wash, spreading your paint nice and evenly. For wet on dry, you're letting your first layer dry completely and then going in with a wet second layer across that dry area. So we're going to let that dry for a couple minutes. We'll come back to it. So we're going to move on to number 4, which is a lift technique. I'm going to go in with a very highly concentrated color, which is why I'm choosing this maroon again. And I'm going to paint one more square. Again, I am using student level paper, which is why you see those gaps, but it's okay, we're just practicing. Okay, spreading my paint around my paper, making it nice and even. So for a lift, you use this technique if you need to remove pigment from your paper. So say you painted something and you didn't like it and you need to pick it back up off the paper. You sweep it, remove the paint, and reload it back into your brush. So I'm sweeping across, reloading that paint. You can tell that the pigment is back in my brush and not on the paper. So I'm going to clean that off and do it one more time. So you want a clean, dry brush, sweep it across, remove that wet paint. And there you go. You have a lift technique. Also handy if you want to create a highlight in a leaf or a floral petal. So now we're going to wait probably 1 more minute for that third square to completely dry. We'll move on to a value scale. So for a value scale, pick just one color and you're going to sweep up and down, moving horizontally across your page, rinsing your pigment off, adding water, and then pulling that paint. You're not going to add more paint. You're just rinsing and pulling. So you're technically adding water to this. A value scale will show you how dark a color can go and how light a color can go. So theoretically, I could create one entire painting just by using one tube of paint, because look how many different shades I can get just by adding water. So with watercolor, when you want to go to a lighter color, not a darker color, you just add water. You don't add white paint like you would with acrylic or oils. So look at this scale, light value and dark value over to the left. Okay, now let's go back to the third square, our wet on dry technique. Now that our first layer has dried, I'm going to load up my brush. I'm using a smaller brush here. Now that it's dried, I'm going to load up my brush with some paint across that first layer. Since it's dry, there's no spreading. My second layer stays in place. My marks are nice and sharp. The water is not there to blend it like it was in the second step. Okay, this technique is great for detail, for grass, for hair in a portrait, for eyes, anything where you don't want it to blend, like up here at the top. Okay, you want it to stay together. So I'll do one more. Let's do another one. Okay, see how it's nice and sharp and detailed? That's the wet on dry technique. So wet paint on top of dry. Okay, now we're going to practice the use of our round brushes. So this is a size 6. It's a pretty standard size. It has a tip to it, which is nice and pointy, and then a belly, which is the rounder part of the brush, where it holds all the water in the pigment. I like round brushes because, like I said, it is dual purpose. We're going to do point, pressure, point. It'll show you that you can get so many different stroke widths by just using one type of brush. So I'm going to use my size 16 just so you guys can see what I'm doing. It's a nice big brush. Again, this is called point, pressure, point. So we're starting with the point of the brush with light pressure. Then we're going to push into the belly of the brush and then back to the point. Okay, starting off, we're just going to get used to really, really light pressure. So at a 90-degree angle or close to 90 degrees, lightly drag your brush across the paper. You'll see how thin of a line you can get. You're just using the tip. Okay, let's go ahead and do that again. You can do this as many times as you need to get used to your pressure. Get a little bit more paint. And now for point, pressure, point, you start with your point and then you add pressure, spreading the bristles of the brush out, showing you how wide of a stroke you can get. Then you release that pressure and bring it back to the point. So you can already see how this method could be used for leaves for a watercolor painting or for petals. Let's do that a couple more times. So point, light pressure, push, 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 and drag and release. That release is very important because it'll bring your brush stroke back to the thin width. Okay, point, pressure, point. Light pressure, hard pressure, light pressure. Say it in your head if you need to. Light, pressure, hard pressure, light pressure. Okay, we're going to apply the techniques that we just went over in a quick little floral study. So I'm going to clean my brush off and we'll start with using the size 16 brush. You can use whatever brush you have. I like this brush for big floral petals because it can cover a lot of area and hold a lot of water. So I'm going to use Buff Titanium from Daniel Smith. It's a nice light nude color, perfect for layer 1. Okay, we're spreading similar to the wash that we started with. Getting used to covering a surface area with one color, evenly distributing the pigments if you want it even. I don't really have a flower in mind. We're just going to practice what we've learned. So loading up my brush with paint, with water, creating some petal shapes. Okay, that's practicing our wash. So now we're going to go in and do our wet on wet. Remember how the water did the work for you and spread it? I'm going to take a darker color and just touch and let the water do the work. You can see how since my paper was still wet, it's starting to bleed and spread the paint. Okay, if you want a little bit more of a spread, go ahead and wet your brush and pull away in the direction where you want the paint to start to bleed, and you'll see that pretty abstract look. I'm going to do that on a couple of the petals. And there's our wet on wet. Okay, if you decide that you don't want that stroke or any stroke on your paper, here's where you would practice your lift technique where you're removing pigment. So with a dry, clean brush, I'm sweeping back over that wet paint that I don't want there and removing it. Easy. Okay, we're going to let this dry before we do any center detail for our wet on dry. Okay, I'm going to do a stem using point, pressure point. Obviously for a stem it's nice and thin, so I'm just going to do point with really light pressure. Going to mix up a green color. I think I'll add some brown just so it's a little bit more interesting of a hue. Okay, and then holding our brush more at a 90-degree angle, light pressure, you're dragging to create that thin line. And then using point pressure, point. Light, hard, and release. Okay, one more time. Light, hard, and release. And there you go, you have some leaves. Okay, we're going to finish off with the wet on dry. So now that it's dried a little bit, we can go in with some detail without the water pulling and spreading the paint like it did in the beginning. Okay, and remember our value scale, that one color has all these values. We're going to do detail with that darker, more concentrated shade. Loading up my brush, I'm just going to add some little dots just to create the illusion of the center of the flower. And there you go. Perfect. Okay, let me know if this was helpful in the comments. I'd love for you to subscribe to this channel. I'll be going over the supplies that I love to use as well as other future tutorials in other videos. So give it a like, give me a comment, let me know what you'd like to learn, and if this was useful for you. Go ahead and subscribe to my channel so you don't miss anything, or you can check out my Instagram, Melanie Stewart Designs, to see what I'm currently working on. Thanks!